In the summer of 1991, the residents of the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street in Milwaukee knew something was wrong with the man in apartment 213. They had been complaining for months. The smell from his unit was unlike anything they had encountered, thick and sweet and wrong in a way that settled in the throat. The building manager had received the complaints. She had spoken to the tenant. He said he was having issues with the freezer. He seemed perfectly calm. He was always perfectly calm. The tenant's name was Jeffrey Dahmer. He was 31 years old. He worked at the Ambrosia chocolate factory and was known to his co-workers as quiet, reliable, and unremarkable. Inside apartment 213, at any given point in that summer, the following could be found: human heads in the refrigerator, skulls preserved on a shelf, a 57-gallon drum dissolving 3 dismembered torsos in an acid solution, 74 Polaroid photographs documenting, in meticulous sequence, the deaths and dismemberments of the men who had come to that apartment and never left. Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 people. The question that the city of Milwaukee and the Milwaukee Police Department still cannot fully answer is how he was allowed to continue for as long as he did, and what was lost because of that failure. This is the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, the 17 men and boys he killed, and the institutions that looked the other way until they could not any longer. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His childhood was marked by his mother Joyce's mental health struggles and his father Lionel's emotional distance. The family moved frequently. Jeffrey was, by account from those who knew him, a shy, introverted child who became increasingly isolated through his teenage years. By the time he was in high school in Bath Township, Ohio, Dahmer had begun drinking heavily. He was dissecting roadkill. He was having thoughts he would later describe, with unnerving precision, to investigators over 60 hours of recorded confession. On June 18, 1978, 3 weeks after graduating from high school, Jeffrey Dahmer killed for the first time. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Mark Hicks, 18 years old, who had been heading to a rock concert. Dahmer brought him home to the empty family house. His parents were away, and when Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer struck him from behind with a barbell and strangled him. He buried the body in the backyard. Then dug it up. Dissolved the flesh with acid. Pulverized the bones with a sledgehammer. Scattered the fragments in the woods behind the house. 9 years passed before he killed again. In the intervening years, he spent time in the United States Army, was discharged for alcohol abuse, moved to Milwaukee, lived briefly with his grandmother in West Allis. During that period, while living with his grandmother, he killed 2 more men. In 1988, he was arrested for drugging and fondling a 13-year-old boy in Milwaukee. He pleaded guilty to second-degree sexual assault. He was sentenced to 5 years of probation and 1 year in a work release program that allowed him to return to his grandmother's house each evening. In the time he had been convicted of assaulting a child and was serving probation for that assault, Jeffrey Dahmer was already looking for an apartment of his own. He found one at 924 North 25th Street. Apartment 213. The victims of Jeffrey Dahmer deserve to be named. They were Stephen Hicks, Stephen Twomey, James Dockstater, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Ricky Beeks, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Strotter, Errol Lindsay, Conorak Sinthasomphon, Anthony Hughes, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, Joseph Braidhoft. 14 of the 17 were from ethnic minority backgrounds. 9 were black. Many were gay or bisexual. Several were homeless or in financial difficulty, making them easier to lure with Dahmer's standard offers, money for photographs, or simply company. They ranged in age from 14 to 36. They came to apartment 213 and they did not leave. What Dahmer did in that apartment has been documented in 100 criminal proceedings, academic studies, and media accounts, and the documented facts are disturbing enough that even the Milwaukee chief medical examiner, a professional who had spent decades in forensic pathology, described what investigators found in July 1991 as more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. Dahmer drugged his victims with sleeping pills dissolved in their drinks. He strangled them. He photographed the entire process. He dismembered the bodies in his bathtub. He kept skulls, which he cleaned and preserved, initially intending to display them in a shrine he was planning to build in the apartment. He kept other body parts in the refrigerator and freezer. He ate portions of some of his victims, later telling investigators he had found it gave him a sense of permanent possession of them. He also experimented. By 1991, Dahmer had begun drilling holes in the skulls of victims who were still alive after drugging and injecting caustic chemicals into their brains, attempting to create permanent, helpless zombie companions who would never leave. None of these experiments succeeded. The men died. One of them, Conorak Synthesomphon, escaped. On the night of May 27, 1991, neighbours of the Oxford apartments saw a young boy in the alley behind the building. He was naked. He was bleeding. He was barely conscious, stumbling and disoriented, clearly in serious distress. His name was Conorak Synthesomphon. He was 14 years old. A neighbour named Glenda Cleveland and her daughter called 911 immediately. Milwaukee police officers John Balcerzak and Joseph Gabrish arrived at the scene. So did Jeffrey Dahmer, who told the officers that the boy was his 19-year-old lover, that they had been drinking, and that the boy was simply intoxicated. Glenda Cleveland protested. She told the officers the boy appeared to be a child. She told them he needed medical attention. She said something was badly wrong. The officers believed Dahmer. They escorted Conorak Synthesomphon back to apartment 213. They left him there. In the recorded 911 call made by Glenda Cleveland, her voice carries the particular strain of a person who knows something terrible is happening and cannot make the people with authority to stop it listen. Intoxicated didn't capture what she saw. 19 didn't match the face of the boy in front of her. One of the responding officers later joked with a dispatcher about the incident. He found it amusing. The call recording was played at his disciplinary hearing. Conorak Synthesomphon was dead within the hour. Dahmer killed him shortly after the police left. Conorak was the younger brother of Somsak Synthesomphon. The 13-year-old boy Dahmer had been convicted of drugging and assaulting in 1988. Had either officer run a background check on Jeffrey Dahmer that night, they would have found that the calm blonde man handing them a plausible story was a convicted child molester serving probation for an offense against a member of this same family. They did not run a check. They accepted the story. They left. Dahmer killed 4 more men after that night before he was finally stopped. On the night of July 22, 1991, a man named Tracy Edwards was running down North 25th Street with a handcuff attached to one wrist. He flagged down 2 officers on patrol. Edwards told them he had been threatened with a knife inside an apartment at 924 North 25th. He led them back to the building. Dahmer answered the door and, showing none of his famous calm, attempted to talk the officers into leaving without searching the apartment. He said the handcuff key was in the bedroom. An officer went to the bedroom to retrieve it. On the way, he glanced at a bedside table and noticed a Polaroid photograph. He looked closer. What he was looking at was a photograph of a dismembered human being. He called his partner. They told Dahmer they needed to look around. Dahmer made a move toward one of the officers. They restrained him and placed him under arrest. They opened the refrigerator. Inside was the severed head of Oliver Lacey, 23 years old, who had been killed 2 weeks earlier. The investigation that followed took days. The apartment had to be processed with hazardous materials equipment. The drum of acid. The skulls on the shelf. The photographs, 74 of them, documenting in methodical sequence what Dahmer had done to the men who came to apartment 213. Investigators worked through the night and into the following days, removing what the medical examiner would describe as a museum of human remains. The building was eventually demolished in 1992. The site was purchased by a nearby university and left as an empty lot. Many of Dahmer's victims' families felt that an appropriate memorial should mark the space. None was ever officially established. The demographics of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims were not random. The vast majority of the men he killed were black gay men from Milwaukee's North Side, a community that had already experienced generations of difficulty with city institutions, including the police department. Many of the victims had been reported missing by their families before Dahmer was arrested. Some of those reports had not been aggressively investigated. The families of some victims, speaking both before and after Dahmer's arrest, described feeling that their loved ones' disappearances had not been treated with the same urgency that might have been applied if the missing people had been from different communities. The Conorak Synthesomphon incident was not an isolated failure. It was a concentrated expression of a pattern of institutional indifference that allowed Dahmer to operate in the open, in a residential building where people were raising complaints for years. After his arrest, the 2 officers who had returned Conorak to Dahmer, Balcerzak and Gabrish, were dismissed from the Milwaukee Police Department. They appealed their dismissal. An arbitration board later reinstated them with back pay. Balcerzak was subsequently elected president of the Milwaukee Police Association. Glenda Cleveland, whose 911 calls and protests had been dismissed, died in 2010. She never received formal recognition from the city for what she had tried to do on that May night in 1991. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began in January 1992. He pleaded guilty but insane, acknowledging that he had killed 17 people, but arguing that the nature of what he had done demonstrated a mind so fundamentally disordered that he could not be held criminally responsible. The legal question, whether Dahmer met Wisconsin's definition of legal insanity, was the sole issue for the jury to decide. The facts of the killings were not in dispute. Dahmer's defense presented psychiatric testimony describing a man whose compulsions had overwhelmed his capacity for normal human functioning. Prosecutors countered with evidence of meticulous planning, systematic concealment, and the ability to project an entirely normal appearance to colleagues and neighbours while committing atrocities behind closed doors. Several of the victims' family members delivered statements in court. Their words, the specific, personal grief of people whose loved ones had been reduced to evidence, were among the most difficult moments in a trial that was already almost impossible to sit through. On February 15, 1992, the jury found Jeffrey Dahmer legally sane. He was convicted of 15 counts of first-degree murder in Wisconsin and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He was subsequently convicted of the 1978 murder of Stephen Hicks in Ohio and received a 16th life sentence. He was transferred to Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver while on a work detail. He was 34 years old. He had served less than 3 years of his sentence. In September 2022, Netflix released Monster, The Jeffrey Dahmer Story, the first season of Ryan Murphy's true crime anthology, with Evan Peters playing Dahmer. It became the most-watched debut of a drama series in Netflix history, accumulating over 196 million hours of viewing in its first 10 days. The series drew significant criticism from the families of Dahmer's victims, many of whom said they had not been consulted in the production and had not been warned it was coming. Rita Isbell, the sister of Errol Lindsay, said watching her own courtroom statement, in which she had leapt across a barrier toward Dahmer before being restrained, recreated on screen without her knowledge felt re-traumatizing. The series was also praised in some quarters for foregrounding the story of Glenda Cleveland, dramatized in the series as a composite character, and for centering the systemic failures that allowed Dahmer to operate. The debate about what the series owed its subjects, and how true crime entertainment should handle the living families of victims, has continued well beyond its release. What the Netflix series undeniably achieved was reintroducing Dahmer's story, and crucially, the names and faces of his victims, to an audience of hundreds of millions of people who had not been alive in 1991. Whether that reintroduction was worth the cost to the families who were not given a choice about it is a question the industry is still sitting with. Stephen Hicks was 18. Stephen Twomey was 24. James Dockstater was 14. Richard Guerrero was 22. Anthony Sears was 26. Ricky Beeks was 33. Edward Smith was 27. Ernest Miller was 22. David Thomas was 22. Curtis Trotter was 18. Errol Lindsay was 19. Konarak Sinthasomphon was 14. Anthony Hughes was 31. Matt Turner was 20. Jeremiah Weinberger was 23. Oliver Lacey was 23. Joseph Braidhoft was 25. 17 people. Primarily young, primarily black, primarily gay men from Milwaukee. People with families who loved them. People whose disappearances were reported and not pursued with urgency. People whose deaths, in the final accounting, happened not only because Jeffrey Dahmer existed but because the city around him created conditions in which he could operate for 13 years. Jeffrey Dahmer is dead. He died in prison in 1994. The building where he killed 12 of his 17 victims was demolished. The lot is empty. What remains is the question of what we owe the people who asked for help before the end, who called 911, who protested to officers, who said something is wrong with the man in apartment 213, and were not believed. Subscribe to Quick Crime Vault. Every case in this vault deserves to be told completely, including the ones that are about more than one man. We'll see you in the next vault.